We're surrounded. Any station. This is Bravo 6. We need fire support now. Gunfire ripped the night apart. Below, the SEALs were seconds from being overrun, but on a wind-scoured ridge no one was watching. She was already in position, prone, breathing slow, one gloved finger brushing the trigger. Her eyes, steady through the scope, tracked the machine gun tearing Bravo 6 to pieces. One squeeze, one shot. The gunner dropped. The battlefield froze. No one down there knew her name. No one knew why she'd come back after vanishing from the teams. But tonight, the Ridge was hers, and the fight had just changed. This is Veteran Biker. Comment 1 if you're new, 2 if you've been with us, 3 if you ride with us every week. Like, subscribe, and stay to the end. The wind knifed through the Zardak Gorge, carrying with it the staccato roar of automatic fire. Dust rose from the shattered ground in thin, angry spirals. Bravo 6 was pinned. Backs pressed to jagged rock, vision smeared with grit, breath drawn in ragged pulls. From 3 elevated positions, enemy fire chewed the canyon walls, sending chips of stone tumbling like shrapnel. Every exit was stitched shut with overlapping fields of lead. No one spoke of retreat. There was nowhere left to go. Through the rattle of rifle bursts, a new sound cracked the air. One single shot, not hurried, not desperate. A sound with weight, with certainty. Across the valley, a machine gun abruptly choked, the gunner's silhouette crumpling behind his weapon. The line of tracer fire that had been pinning them from the east guttered out, leaving an unnatural pocket of silence in the storm. Heads jerked toward one another, eyes wide, not in relief, but in confusion. Before anyone could form the question, the radio hissed, a calm voice sliding into their comms on a channel none of them recognized. Sentinel-9 active. Stand by for extraction window. No name, no unit. Just those words, delivered with the measured cadence of someone who wasn't guessing. 12 hours earlier, far from the dust and blood of the gorge, the air at Forward Operating Base Stonehaven smelled faintly of solvent and oiled steel. In a corner of the armory, where the fluorescent lights flickered with lazy disinterest, Ilara Vance worked in silence. Her left hand was bound in a wide strip of black magnetic therapy cloth, the kind issued to veterans with nerve damage when surgery could no longer promise miracles. The wrap clung snugly against bone and tendon, allowing her to thread the fine cleaning rod into the bore of a Nemesis LR-25 with a surgeon's steadiness. Around her, the room had its own rhythm, the metallic click of charging handles being tested, the muted thud of boots on the concrete floor, voices tossing banter like cards in a game only the young found amusing. Ilara kept her eyes on the rifle in front of her, moving from chamber to magazine well with unhurried precision. Years ago, these same movements had been part of a ritual she performed under entirely different skies. Back then, every stroke of the cleaning brush was a prayer whispered in the dark. From across the room, Calder Briggs leaned on a crate, a smirk curling at the edge of his mouth. "Guess they'll let anyone handle our long guns now," he said, pitching his voice just loud enough for the rest of the section to hear, even the ones who might need a stool just to reach the sights. A few glances were traded, the kind that carried unease but no intervention. Calder was fresh from sniper school, his confidence as untested as it was abundant. Ilara's shoulders remained square to her work. She tapped the last trace of powder from the bore and set the rod aside. In that moment, Major Rourke stepped into the armory, a folder under one arm. His gaze swept the room, pausing briefly on Briggs before settling on Ilara. Unlike the others, Rourke had seen things in her personnel record that weren't meant for casual eyes. "Vance," he said evenly, "I need those scope alignments double-checked. Bravo 6 moves out tonight." She acknowledged him with a short nod, her tone steady when she replied, "I'll have them ready." When Rourke moved on, Briggs let out a breathy laugh, unable to leave the silence alone. Careful out there, Major. She might recalibrate them. So far off we'll be aiming at the moon. The rifle in Ilara's hands slid back into its case. She closed the latches with deliberate pressure, then turned toward Briggs. "You're right," she said, her voice carrying a faint lilt from somewhere far east of here. "I've made mistakes before, 3 of them. Their names were Holt, Reyes, and Ewan." The room quieted. Even the soft hum of the ventilation seemed to fade. "They died in a valley not too different from where you're going tonight. You'd be wise to remember that luck is the only thing more fragile than confidence." For the first time, Briggs's grin faltered. Outside, the mountains loomed against a sky already paling toward dusk. Within the maze of Stonehaven's corridors, Rourke waited for Ilara by the comms room. He spoke low, his words meant for her alone. "The intelligence on Bravo 6 is up. It's too clean. Reads like someone's feeding them exactly what they want to hear." Ilara's eyes narrowed, not in surprise, but in recognition. "Patterns can be manufactured, so can kill zones." He handed her a slim tablet, its screen alive with satellite images and grid overlays. "I can't scrub the mission without proof, but if you were watching it unfold, with your experience, you'd see things the rest of us might miss." The thought of stepping into the fight again tightened something in her chest. Yet the decision had already been made in the part of her that never really left the field. She closed the tablet and tucked it under her arm. "I'll need the long-range comms array, and access to my old kit." Rourke gave a small, grim smile. "You'll have both. Just don't make me explain to Command how a weapons tech ended up saving an entire team." The faintest flicker of a reply ghosted across her expression. "If I do my job right, no one will know." Later, as the shadows stretched across the compound, the heavy thump of rotor blades signaled Bravo 6's departure. The sound stirred something deep, a memory of dust choking her throat, of wind snapping at her hair in the open door of a helicopter racing toward chaos. She stood at the edge of the flight line, the chill of evening creeping through her jacket, and watched until the birds became specks against the mountains. In the dim glow of the comms room, she unpacked the Nemesis LR-25. The rifle's weight was unchanged, but her hands knew it differently now, as both a burden and a promise. On the workbench beside it, she laid out an array of gear that had not seen daylight in years: a compact spotting scope with worn dials, a data book swollen with notes in an unbreakable cipher, a weather meter scuffed from countless drops into dirt and gravel. Her fingertips brushed the carved notches along the rifle's stock. 3 marks, 3 lives she could not reclaim. The room's lone radio operator glanced up as she connected cables and adjusted dials on the aging comms rack. "Thought you were just here to check alignments," he said. "Sometimes," Ilara replied. "You check more than equipment." On the main screen, a digital map of the Sharvad region bloomed, laced with faint signals flickering in and out of the noise floor. Each one was a thread. She began to weave them together. In the gorge, hours later, Bravo 6 would fight for every heartbeat, and far above them, someone would be waiting, scope to her eye, already knowing where the first shot must fall. The hum of the comms array was the only sound in the room, a steady undertone that seemed to pull Ilara deeper into the work. On the display, lines of encrypted chatter scrolled like the pulse of a hidden world, bursts of data rising and falling in erratic rhythm. She tracked each anomaly with the precision of someone who had learned to read between signals, searching for the pattern behind the noise. Outside, the mountains were shedding the last light of day, their ridges painted in copper and shadow. Stonehaven was winding into its night routine, vehicles returning from patrol, generators coughing to life, the smell of fuel drifting on the thin air. Somewhere beyond those walls, Bravo 6 was closing in on their insertion point, unaware of how closely the shape of their mission mirrored another from years ago. Ilara adjusted her seat, leaning closer to the array. A narrow spike appeared on the spectrum analyzer. Too brief to be idle static, too deliberate to be coincidence. She followed it to its source, layering maps and signal logs until a picture began to emerge. Enemy positions weren't static, they shifted in response to invisible cues, movements choreographed with an accuracy that hinted at a guiding hand. She recognized the structure, a decoy command post pulling attention while secondary teams maneuvered into place. It was the same tactic that had closed the jaws on her own unit. She keyed in a secure message, sending a red flag alert to Rourke. Within seconds, his voice came through the direct line. "You're sure?" "Certain," she said. "They've set the stage. All that's left is to wait for the curtain to fall." There was a pause, the kind that weighed options too fast to articulate. "Command won't scrub it on your suspicion alone. It's not suspicion, it's replication." The same formation, the same false entry points, the same calm silence just before engagement. They're baiting them in. "I can't change their route without hard proof." "Then I'll get it." She cut the line before he could argue. Her focus narrowed to the web of enemy signals, charting them with deliberate strokes on a digital overlay. The Nemesis lay assembled on the bench beside her, the matte black barrel catching the faint green of the display. Her gear was already prepped, magazines lined in a neat row, the weather meter clipped to her vest. She moved like a shadow through the corridors of Stonehaven, bypassing the main gates and slipping into the lesser-used service route that skirted the southern perimeter. The guards barely glanced at her. A weapons tech moving equipment drew no suspicion. Outside the wire, the night air hit with a sharp drop in temperature, carrying the faint metallic tang of approaching weather. The terrain beyond the base was a quilt of shale slopes and thorned scrub, the ground uneven and brittle under her boots. Each step was measured, conserving strength for the climb ahead. She knew exactly where she was going. A ledge that overlooked the Zardak Gorge from a height no one would think to search. The path was brutal, a narrow cut between stone walls that forced her to move single file through darkness and pale slivers of moonlight. She scaled the first ridge without breaking pace, the memory of past descents guiding her feet as surely as the faint glow of her GPS. The second rise was steeper, its surface loose underfoot, forcing her to use hands and knees to gain purchase. Thorns caught at her sleeves, scoring faint lines against the fabric, but she didn't slow. Every minute lost was a minute Bravo 6 remained exposed. Halfway up, she paused, crouching low as a cluster of lights swept across the valley floor. Enemy scouts moving along a lower trail, their voices floated up in bursts of a language she understood only in fragments, enough to catch the urgency in their tone. They passed without looking up, and she resumed her climb, each movement deliberate to avoid dislodging stones that would betray her. The final ascent opened onto a plateau of weathered rock, the wind sharper here, tasting faintly of rain. She moved to the far edge, unpacking the Nemesis and locking its bipod into a natural groove between stones. The scope's reticle came alive in her eye, painting the gorge below in sharp relief. Through the glass, she could see Bravo 6 advancing along a dry riverbed, their formation tight, unaware of the arcs of fire already aligning against them. Ilara shifted her view to the high ridges flanking the gorge. Heat signatures marked 3 heavy positions, their barrels trained to converge on the kill zone. She tracked one arc back to a figure crouched over a portable command station, his attention fixed on the screen. He was the conductor here, coordinating the trap. She breathed out slowly, adjusting for the wind slicing across her position. The first shot would not be to kill. The point was to fracture their rhythm, force them to react instead of execute. She aimed for the equipment, the crosshairs settling over the device's casing. The rifle's report cracked through the night, echoing along the stone like a warning shot from the earth itself. In the scope, she saw the device splinter, shards of glass and metal spraying across the operator's face. He recoiled, clutching at his eyes, and the controlled cadence of fire from the ridges broke into uneven bursts. On the gorge floor, Bravo 6 hesitated, then pressed forward under the sudden slackening of fire. Elara shifted, her next target already chosen, the ammunition feed on the eastern ridge. Another breath, another trigger squeeze, and the belt-fed weapon stuttered, jamming with a violent kick that sent its gunner scrambling. The comms in her earpiece lit up with fragments of Bravo 6's internal net. Voices calling sectors, reporting movement, reassessing the fight. She kept her breathing steady, tracking threats, choosing each shot to shape the enemy's decisions. A leader exposed himself to rally a squad. She took him out cleanly, the round punching through the space just above his rifle's sights. The enemy's precision began to unravel. Without centralized control, their lines wavered, opening narrow lanes that Bravo 6 could exploit. Elara keyed into the old Sentinel unit frequency, her voice low but sharp. "Move south. Grid 7-5. No acknowledgement came. There wouldn't be, not on a frequency that official rosters claimed didn't exist. But she saw them shift, altering their path toward the southern slope. A new cluster of heat blooms appeared on her display, moving fast along the western ridge. Reinforcements. They'd realized the sniper's position was the pivot point and were maneuvering to cut her off. She calculated their route and timing, the pieces of the board rearranging in her mind. She had minutes at best before they reached a line of sight on her perch. Below, Bravo 6 was still in the gorge, making ground but not fast enough to outrun the tightening noose. Elara adjusted her angle, firing on a group attempting to flank from the northeast. One dropped, then another, the survivors diving for cover. She could feel the rhythm of the fight shifting again, the weight tilting fraction by fraction toward escape. The western group was closing. She dismounted the rifle, breaking it down with practiced efficiency and stowing it in the pack. From here, her path would be mobile, striking from multiple points to disguise the fact that there was only one shooter. She descended along a narrow spur, emerging onto a lower shelf of rock that offered a new vantage on the gorge's mouth. From here, she could see Bravo 6 breaking into a staggered sprint, bounding in pairs toward the rise that would carry them out of the kill zone. The enemy was pursuing, but their fire was less disciplined now, arcs crossing and wasting rounds. Elara took a knee, steadied her rifle, and sent a round into the lead pursuer's pack. The detonation flared, scattering the group and buying seconds more for the team below. The earpiece crackled again with a voice she recognized from the mission brief. "Sergeant Hale, Bravo 6's lead. Whoever you are, keep it coming. We've got daylight ahead if we can make that ridge." She didn't respond. Words weren't the job here. Results were. The gorge began to narrow behind Bravo 6, the walls funneling their retreat into a single climb. It was a choke point, perfect for defense but deadly if the pursuers gained it first. Elara shifted fire to targets along that route, slowing the enemy's advance with each precise hit. Her position was compromised. The western group crested a ridge opposite her, muzzles flashing in the dark. She dropped behind cover, shards of rock stinging her cheek as rounds struck the ledge. She moved laterally, crouched low, circling toward an exit route she'd mapped long before tonight. Each turn was chosen to keep her unseen, to draw the chase away from the team still fighting their way up the slope. The last she saw of Bravo 6 in that phase was a flash of movement at the ridge's edge, silhouettes hauling one another over the crest. Beyond them, the pale wash of the open plateau promised space and survival. Elara disappeared into the folds of the mountain, the nemesis cradled close, her boots finding the old smuggler's path by memory. The fight wasn't finished. It was only shifting to a different part of the map, and she would be there when it did. Alara kept low as she moved along the jagged contour, every footfall measured to avoid the loose scree that could betray her position. The wind had shifted, carrying the sharp scent of cordite from the fight below and the faint tang of approaching rain. Her breathing stayed level, her thoughts narrowing to the path ahead, a route that would swing wide around the western rise and bring her parallel to the team's line of retreat. The first bend dropped her into a gully barely wider than her shoulders. She moved fast, bent at the waist, rifle slung, and hands free to steady herself against the slick rock walls. The chase had gone quieter behind her, but that didn't mean it had stopped. The enemy was regrouping, recalculating. She needed to be in position before they struck again. At the gully's end, the terrain opened into a series of broken shelves descending toward the gorge mouth. She crouched at the edge, scanning through her spotting scope. Bravo 6 was visible in fragments. A helmet crest here, the glint of a scope lens there, pushing hard toward the southern slope she'd signaled earlier. They were making ground, but not enough. Across the opposite ridge, a separate group of fighters moved with deliberate speed, aiming to cut off the escape route entirely. She swung the scope toward the intercept path, counting movement in 3s and 4s. They weren't rushing. They were confident in their timing, certain they'd be in position before the SEALs crested the rise. That confidence needed to be broken. She unzipped a side pocket, pulling out a compact suppressor and threading it onto the rifle. Sound discipline would keep them guessing. Her first shot took the lead man in the thigh, dropping him without killing. The formation hesitated, attention snapping to their wounded comrade. She put the next round into the rock at their flank, sending splinters across their line. They scattered for cover, their advance disrupted, buying precious moments for the climb ahead. She adjusted her position by crawling along the lip of the shelf, keeping her profile low against the skyline. Through the scope, she saw 2 of the intercept team break off, trying to flank her location. She withdrew silently, circling back toward a narrow draw that funneled into the higher ground. The move was risky. It would put her closer to the main body of pursuers, but it also gave her a vantage to engage both threats at once. From her new perch, the battlefield unfolded like a layered map, Bravo 6 pushing upward under sporadic fire. The intercept team slowed but not stopped, and the larger force pressing from behind. She cycled through targets methodically, her shots aimed to wound or force cover rather than eliminate. The point was to shape the fight, to keep the enemy looking the wrong way at the wrong time. Movement in the corner of her vision pulled her attention left. 3 fighters were climbing fast toward her, using a goat trail etched into the rock. She shifted, dropping the first with a controlled shot, the second with a strike to his chest rig that sent him tumbling back. The third froze, his weapon half raised, before slipping down out of sight. She didn't wait to confirm. Time was bleeding away. She descended 2 ledges in quick sequence, boots sliding on loose grit until she reached a saddle between ridges. From here, the southern slope was visible in full, Bravo 6 just reaching the lip. They were exposed now, silhouetted against the lighter sky beyond, and the intercept team saw it too. Enemy rifles snapped up. Alara drew a bead on the nearest marksman and fired, the round striking his weapon's stock and spinning it from his grip. She swept to the next, forcing him down behind cover, then another, keeping a rhythm that left no gap for coordinated fire. Through it all, the SEALs moved, one after another, over the top and into the plateau. With the team over the rise, her role shifted. The chase would shift direction now, angling toward the plateau's far edge where the extraction point lay. She needed to redirect the pursuit entirely. Slinging her rifle, she sprinted along the ridgeline, using the uneven ground to mask her movement. Each stride was a calculation between speed and silence. She dropped into another drawer, this one choked with thornbush and loose boulders, and pulled a small bundle from her vest. The tripwire charge was crude but effective, the kind designed to maim rather than kill. She strung it between two rocks at knee height, covering the approach from the rear. Another went higher at chest level, in the shadow of an overhang. The distant crack of rifle fire told her the enemy had crested the southern slope behind Bravo 6. She moved to the far side of the draw, took up a prone position, and sighted down the line of their advance. Her shot into the lead fighter's pack triggered a spray of shrapnel that dropped him instantly and sent his companions diving for cover. From their perspective, it would look as if multiple shooters were strung along the ridge. She reinforced that illusion by shifting 20 meters and firing again, then again from a slightly different angle. The echoes rolled unpredictably through the stone, making it impossible to pinpoint her. The intercept team, now in disarray, began pulling back toward the main body, leaving only a few to keep pressure on the SEAL's route. Elara let them go. Her priority was to keep the bulk of the force focused on her. She rose from cover, making herself visible just long enough for a cluster of enemy rifles to snap toward her, then vanished behind the rocks. Bullets hammered the stone as she broke contact, retreating toward a narrow chute that funneled into lower ground. She could feel the shift in the chase, the energy of the hunt turning fully toward her, away from the plateau. That was the trade she'd chosen. The chute opened into a basin where the ground was littered with old shell casings, a reminder of some forgotten skirmish. She crossed it quickly, heading for a cleft in the far wall that led into a twisting pass. Here, the rock rose high on both sides, the sky reduced to a thin strip overhead. The acoustics turned every footstep into a muted thud, masking her movement from those following. Halfway through, she planted another device, this one in the shadow of a boulder where the trail narrowed to single file. The pursuers would be funneled into it without seeing the tripwire until too late. At the far end of the pass, she emerged onto a ledge with a view back into the basin. Figures spilled into it moments later, moving cautiously now, scanning for threats. She fired once, twice, not to hit but to keep them low. Then she turned and vanished over the crest, moving deeper into the maze of ridges. The chase was on her terms now. She chose the paths that demanded single-file movement, the gullies where an unseen shooter could dominate the approach, the shelves where the only cover was too far from where they needed it. Every minute she held them here was a minute Bravo 6 gained on their march to safety. She heard the first detonation behind her, a flat, ugly blast followed by shouting, a pause, then the second, higher up, the echoes snapping off the rock. They were slowed, injured, distracted. Elara pressed on, cutting across a slope that crumbled underfoot, forcing her into a half-slide until she caught herself on a jag of stone. She pulled up the scope, checking the plateau in the distance. Bravo 6 was no longer visible. A good sign. It meant they were moving fast and low toward the extraction grid. She moved again, angling toward a ridge that would give her one last sight line on the pursuers. The climb was steep, her muscles protesting after hours of strain, but she forced the pace. At the top, she set the rifle on its bipod and scanned. The enemy was spread thin now, the lead element still dogged but the rear falling behind. She began picking them off in sequence, targeting those who were pushing the hardest, cutting into the momentum of the chase. A pair tried to flank up the ridge. She shifted to meet them, dropping one and forcing the other back down. The fight had stretched, the edge blunting for those chasing her, but she couldn't afford to think it over. As she worked the bolt on another round, she saw movement to the far north, a dust plume rising along a low track. It wasn't the enemy, it was the shape of salvation, the inbound rotor wash of an extraction bird heading for Bravo 6's coordinates. She allowed herself a single breath of relief. Then she broke down the rifle again, stowed it, and disappeared over the far side of the ridge, leaving only the wind to sweep away the evidence she'd ever been there. The rotor beat of the extraction bird faded into the distance, swallowed by the folds of the mountains. Ilara stayed crouched in the lee of the ridge, listening for the cadence of boots or the telltale rasp of voices. Nothing. The pursuit had lost cohesion, scattered across too many gullies and false leads. She'd bought the team their opening. Now came the part no one would see, the part that would vanish from any official account. She moved downslope at an oblique angle, avoiding the obvious descent paths. The ground here was fractured stone, dark with lichen and slick in spots where meltwater trickled unseen. Each step was deliberate, weight distributed to keep her center low. The Nemesis rode light across her shoulder, its components broken down and wrapped to mute their rattle. Ahead, a narrow seam in the rock promised cover and a vantage over the valley floor. When she reached it, she went to her knees and eased the spotting scope into place. Below, a knot of fighters had regrouped. They moved without the urgency of the chase, their weapons held loose, scanning the slopes half-heartedly. Leaders conferred in low tones, one gesturing toward the plateau where Bravo 6 had vanished. They thought she was somewhere between here and there. That suited her. She withdrew from the seam, looping back into the high ground. The wind had turned colder, carrying flecks of moisture that stung against her cheek. Clouds were lowering over Shavard's peaks, their bellies heavy and dark. In this weather, the search would slow, visibility would shrink to a handful of paces in the mist. She used it. The first tendrils of fog were curling along the ridges as she crossed into a boulder field littered with fragments the size of trucks. Here she cached the rifle in a crevice, marked only in her own cipher on the slate beside it. If she was taken, they wouldn't have that weapon to parade. If she lived, she could recover it later. From there, she descended toward a dry watercourse that wound through the lower ranges. The bed was choked with gravel and the occasional rusted shell casing, relics from battles that had burned through here long before her time. She moved in the channel's curve, hidden from sight, until she came upon a shallow bend. Voices again. She stilled, then inched forward to the lip. 3 men, their uniforms mismatched but their weapons well maintained, were setting up a listening post. They had line of sight down the watercourse and into a segment of the plateau's approach. Left alone, they'd be a hazard to the extraction. She checked her watch, counted backward from what she knew of the team's pace. There was time, but not enough to be careless. She eased the suppressed sidearm from its holster, marked the arcs of each man's vision. 2 quick steps out of cover, 2 rounds placed center mass, and the third man spun, eyes wide, before her follow-up took him in the throat. She dragged the bodies into the brush, cleared their kit of radios and ammunition, and dumped the rifles into the deepest pool she could find under the gravel. It wasn't elegant, but it would delay their discovery until well after sunrise. By the time she climbed out of the watercourse, the fog had thickened into a pale wall. She navigated by memory and compass, cutting a diagonal that would put her between any trailing forces and the plateau. Her legs burned from the climb, her breathing measured and quiet. She couldn't hear the fighters anymore, but that didn't mean they were gone. Only that the mist swallowed their sounds before they reached her. She crested another ridge, lower than the one she'd held earlier, and dropped into a crouch to survey what little she could see. The valley below was a smear of grey, but movement stirred within it, faint shadows pacing, stopping, shifting direction. The enemy was probing now, no longer certain where she'd gone. That uncertainty was leverage. She reached into her pack and pulled out the compact signal jammer. Flipping it on, she tuned it to the frequency she'd intercepted earlier, the one carrying orders between dispersed units. Static flared in her earpiece. Down in the mist, two of the shadows halted, gesturing as if trying to make sense of a sudden silence. She left the jammer running and moved laterally along the ridge, pausing at intervals to throw a rock into the scree or shift a loose stone just enough to clatter. In the fog, every sound became magnified, its source impossible to pin. She was building a ghost for them to chase, an invisible presence that seemed to be everywhere at once. The ruse worked longer than she expected. By the time the fog began to thin under the first hints of dawn, the fighters had drawn off in the wrong direction, chasing echoes up a spur that led to nowhere. She watched until their shapes dissolved into the distance, then turned toward the east where the light was breaking over the peaks. The climb down from the ridge was slow, the rock wet and treacherous. She took it in sections, always with 3 points of contact, pausing to scan the folds of terrain for any sign of movement. The extraction bird was gone now, the only sign of its presence a churned patch of dust on the plateau's far edge. She reached the basin at the ridge's base just as the sun broke fully over the horizon, gilding the stone in a light that felt too calm for the night behind her. She stopped in the shadow of an overhang, unshouldered her pack, and sat with her back to the rock. The sidearm lay across her knees, one magazine still heavy with rounds she hadn't needed. It would have been easy to stay there, let the warmth seep into her bones, let the distance grow between herself and the fight. But she knew better. Somewhere in the sprawl of ranges beyond, there would be another operation, another team stepping into a plan they didn't know was rigged. She stood, slung the pack again, and set her boots toward the interior. The path ahead was uncertain, but she had the maps in her head, the terrain etched into her reflexes. The game wasn't finished. By midday, she'd reached the first of the abandoned outposts that dotted the Shavard range. It was a shell of stone walls and a collapsed roof, once a waypoint for patrols, now claimed by dust and wind. She checked it for signs of recent use, a scuffed footprint, the blackened circle of a cook fire, but found nothing fresh. It would serve as a vantage point for a few hours. From the upper wall, she had a view back toward the plateau, a sweep of pale stone framed by the darker teeth of the mountains. Somewhere out there, Bravo 6 would be shaking the dust from their gear, loading into a bird for the flight home. They'd tell the story of the unseen rifle that had cut a path for them, argue over whether it was one shooter or two, and none would guess the truth. The thought settled something in her. She'd given them an ending they could carry without the weight of knowing who had stood between them and the drop. That was enough. She turned from the wall, dropped back into the ruin's shadow, and pulled a folded scrap of paper from her vest. It was covered in her tight, slanted cipher. Each mark a coordinate or a name or a caution. She added 3 new entries: the position of the listening post, the unit markings on the fighters she'd seen, and a note on their equipment that suggested outside supply. The page went into a waterproof pouch, sealed and slid into a hidden compartment in her pack. Somewhere down the line it would reach Rourke. He'd know what to do with it, just as he'd know not to ask how she'd come by it. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying the smell of rain from the high passes. Ilara stepped into it, pulling her jacket tight, and began walking toward the next rise. The peaks ahead loomed dark against the pale sky, their ridges like the edge of a serrated blade. Somewhere beyond them there would be another fight worth showing up for. She would be there first. By late afternoon, the peaks around Shavard were cloaked in a slate haze, the sun reduced to a dull coin pressing through layers of cloud. Ilara moved along a contour path that threaded between 2 ridges, its edges crumbling away to the drop below. The old outpost was now a speck behind her, its stone walls disappearing into the rock as though it had never existed. Ahead lay a spine of high ground she had memorized years ago, a place where the wind never stopped, where every sound carried twice as far as it should. She advanced without hesitation, scanning for the subtle signs of human passage, a scuffed rock, the unnatural bend of a thorn bush, the dull gleam of metal where none should be. Her eyes caught a faint ripple in the brush ahead, the kind caused by fabric in motion. She froze, shifted her stance, and brought the binoculars to her face. Through the glass she counted 4 men, spaced in a staggered file, their weapons held at the ready. They weren't wandering. They were following a heading that would take them past her position within minutes. She stepped back into the cover of a fissure, setting her pack down without a sound. From the side pouch, she retrieved a compact sensor, a disc barely larger than her palm, and placed it flat against the rock. The device began transmitting a narrow signal to her earpiece, translating ground vibration into a soft, steady tone. It was a way to see without sight, one she'd learned when visibility failed, but the threat remained. The rhythm of their footfalls told her they were closing the distance. She readied the sidearm but kept the rifle in its case. The goal wasn't a long-range engagement. When the first silhouette appeared against the lighter stone beyond, she waited until he'd passed the midpoint between 2 markers she'd chosen in her mind. The shot was quiet, a suppressed crack that dropped him where he stood. The others reacted instantly, splitting for cover on either side of the trail. She pivoted, firing once to the left, forcing one man behind a boulder, then rolling right to tag another in the shoulder before he could aim. The 4th broke into a run, retreating down the path they'd come. She didn't pursue. The noise of his escape was as valuable as his absence from the fight. Moving quickly, she disarmed the 2 wounded men, stripping their radios and scattering the parts into the scrub. She left them alive but immobile, knowing their voices over the net would draw reinforcements she could predict and prepare for. By the time she reached the high spine, the air had thickened with the smell of ozone. Rain was coming, but not yet. She set the Nemesis on its bipod and sighted in along the valley. Below, the terrain funneled into a narrow pass before spilling onto a plateau where 2 dirt tracks crossed. That junction was a natural choke point and a perfect place for an ambush. Through the scope she caught glimpses of movement in the pass, shadows slipping between rocks, shapes too deliberate to be animals. They were setting positions unseen by anyone not looking for the patterns she knew so well. Her pulse stayed even, her breathing a steady cadence as she counted them, noted their spacing, and found the commander in the mix. A taller figure gesturing with short, sharp motions. Her first shot took the rock beside his head, the impact spraying grit into his eyes and forcing him down. She shifted instantly to the far flank, targeting a heavy weapon crew before they could settle their gun. One dropped, the other dove out of sight. The confusion was immediate. Their carefully prepared crossfire broke apart as units scrambled to cover angles they thought had been compromised. She used that confusion to relocate, crawling along the crest until she had a new angle on the junction. This time she aimed for their communications relay, a small antenna ray hidden behind a boulder. The round struck the base, snapping cables and toppling it onto its side. Down in the pass, a runner bolted toward the rear, likely to carry word of the disruption. She let him go. The more they relied on foot messengers, the slower their coordination would be. As she settled back behind the rifle, the first drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the rock around her. The sound covered her movements as she packed the weapon away and slid down the lee side of the ridge. She knew the enemy would be probing upward now, searching for the shooter who had unmade their ambush before it began. The descent was rough, the ground turning slick under her boots. She used the butt of her sidearm as a brace on the steeper pitches, lowering herself with controlled slides where the stone offered no holds. At the base, she moved into a run, following a faint animal trail that curved toward the rear of the pass. The rain thickened, turning into a steady curtain that blurred the edges of the world. She welcomed it. Visibility cut both ways, and her path was easier to hide now. She circled wide, coming in behind a cluster of fighters who were still focused on the plateau. Drawing the suppressed pistol again, she worked methodically. 2 shots at close range, another when one tried to flee into the rocks. By the time the rain began to ease, the pass had gone quiet. The ambush was broken, the survivors scattered in the wrong directions. She stood for a moment in the damp air, feeling the muscles in her shoulders unwind, just enough to remind her they'd been clenched for hours. Her attention shifted back toward the plateau. Somewhere beyond it, Bravo 6 would be making their way toward a secondary extraction zone. She had no comms link with them now, that was by design, but her mental map of the terrain told her where they'd go next. If she moved quickly, she could sweep the approach and clear it before the team arrived. She set off along the base of the ridge, skirting the pools of water gathering in the low spots. Each step was chosen to leave the smallest possible print in the mud. The sky above was beginning to lighten again as the clouds drifted east, revealing the ridgeline in sharper relief. When she crested the next rise, the land dropped into a shallow basin dotted with scrub. In the center stood a weathered stone marker, half buried and leaning. It was an old guidepost from another era, long before these mountains became a war map. She paused there, scanning the arcs of approach. On the far side of the basin, more movement, a small team advancing cautiously, their rifles sweeping. They hadn't spotted her, but they were moving toward the line Bravo 6 would have to cross. She slipped down the slope, keeping to the cover of the thicker brush. At 20 meters, she knelt, took a steadying breath and opened fire. 2 went down before the others could react. The rest fell back toward a cluster of rocks, firing blind into the brush. She stayed low, shifting her position after each shot, the echoes bouncing unpredictably in the basin. When the last of them broke and ran, she didn't chase. The way forward was clear enough for now. Ilara checked the horizon once more, then moved to the edge of the basin. The path beyond climbed in a slow, even grade toward the saddle where the extraction would likely take place. She adjusted the pack on her shoulders, felt the weight settle evenly, and started the climb. The nemesis balanced against her spine. Every step toward that saddle was a step further from the chaos she'd left behind, but not from the war. That would follow, as it always had, until she chose to vanish again. For now, she kept moving, her eyes fixed on the rise ahead, her mind already measuring the next fight she might have to win before anyone knew it was there. Ilara reached the crest of the saddle as the first light bled over the eastern ridges, washing the stone in pale gold. From here she had a clear line of sight across the plateau that sloped away toward a narrow canyon, the likely corridor for any inbound extraction bird. The air was still damp from the rain, each breath carrying the mineral tang of wet rock. She dropped to one knee, unpacking the spotting scope before laying the nemesis beside it. Through the glass, the landscape stretched in overlapping bands of scrub, boulder, and fractured earth. A flicker of movement drew her attention to a cluster of ruins half buried near the canyon's mouth. 2 figures were posted there, rifles resting across the broken stone, their focus trained on the approach. She shifted her view, tracing arcs of movement along the slopes to either side. More fighters, concealed in the folds of terrain, their positions chosen to converge fire on anyone crossing open ground. The setup was too deliberate for coincidence. Someone had predicted the route and positioned assets to exploit it. Ilara keyed the range into her scope's reticle and adjusted for wind that slid along the saddle from the north. Her first shot punched a hole through the slab in front of the left-hand sentry, the impact sending a cloud of grit into his face. As he stumbled back, the second man swung toward the sound, just in time to take a round through the shoulder. The shift in their focus was immediate. The hidden positions on the slopes began to stir, rifles snapping toward the saddle. She rolled to her right. letting the first incoming rounds chew harmlessly into the ridge where she'd been prone seconds earlier. From the new angle she sighted on a gunner adjusting his bipod, the shot striking his mount and sending the weapon spinning into the dirt. They were alert now, but that alertness worked against them. Firing lines overlapped poorly when everyone was looking toward a single point. She kept moving, each shot from a slightly different location, giving the illusion of multiple shooters on the high ground. In the chaos, several broke from cover to reposition, exposing themselves long enough for her to disrupt the rhythm of their advance. She watched the gaps widen between them, then slung the rifle and pulled the sidearm. Descending the rear slope of the saddle, she followed a goat trail that curved toward the canyon's flank. The trail was narrow, forcing her to sidestep along sections where the drop fell away sharply. The sounds of the fight above faded, replaced by the slow drip of water from the canyon wall and the occasional grind of gravel under her boots. When she reached the base, she cut across a field of jagged stone toward a low spur that offered cover along the canyon's rim. Peering over, she saw a small team setting demolition charges along the canyon floor, a trap for whatever vehicle might attempt the approach. Their discipline was obvious. Each movement was efficient, each placement precise. She waited until the man carrying the detonator moved apart from the group. One round from the suppressed pistol took him in the side, sending the device tumbling from his grip. She dropped the next two before the others could orient on her position, the cracks of her shots swallowed by the canyon's depth. Sliding down to the floor, she disarmed the remaining explosives, stripping the detonators and tossing them into the stream that ran shallow through the canyon bed. The charges themselves she left in place, inert but still convincing enough to slow an enemy advance if discovered later. From deeper in the canyon, the low thump of rotor blades began to build. She pressed against the wall, scanning the sky through the narrow cut above. A helicopter's shadow rippled across the rim before the aircraft itself appeared, nose dipping slightly as it descended into the corridor. It wasn't friendly. The paint was muted, the shape familiar in a way that didn't belong to Coalition airframes. The helicopter flared, setting down on a patch of flat stone 200 meters away. Figures spilled from the side doors, their kit mismatched, but their weapons high-grade. They moved with purpose toward the plateau, likely to reinforce the fighters she'd just displaced. Ilara retreated into the canyon's wall, using an overhang to mask her movement. She let the first two pass, waited for the third, then stepped out behind him, striking with the edge of her forearm. He dropped without a sound. She caught his rifle before it hit the ground, cycling the bolt to confirm a round was chambered. With the captured weapon, she took position behind a boulder and sighted on the tail rotor assembly of the helicopter. The burst walked across the hub, severing key linkages. The machine shuddered, then settled unevenly, its crew scrambling to assess the damage. She didn't wait for them to recover. She was already moving back toward the slope that would return her to the saddle. The climb was harder this time, her thighs burning as she pulled herself over the final lip. Below, the plateau lay momentarily empty, the ambush broken, the reinforcements delayed. But it wouldn't last. She needed to be gone before they regrouped. She retrieved the Nemesis and glassed the far side of the plateau one last time. A cluster of figures was emerging from the scrub, familiar in their discipline, their movement patterns. Bravo 6. They were low and fast, weapons up, scanning even as they advanced. She felt the tight coil in her chest ease just enough to exhale. They were making for the canyon mouth she had cleared, but she could see the shapes of fighters rallying behind the ruins. No time to signal. She dropped prone, set her crosshairs on the lead threat, and began firing in a steady cadence that cut each pursuer down as they came into view. The SEALs reached the cleared section without breaking stride, vanishing into the canyon's shadow. Ilara watched until the last of them disappeared, then disassembled the rifle for the final time that night. She stowed each part carefully, tightened the pack straps, and started down the opposite side of the saddle. The light was shifting again, the angle of the sun turning the stone a deeper hue. Somewhere far behind her, shouts rose, scattered and angry. She didn't look back. The job wasn't about being seen, and it wasn't about being thanked. It was about making sure the right people walked out, even if they never knew who made it possible. The sound of the canyon faded, replaced by the quiet breath of the wind moving between ridges. She followed it deeper into the range, her boots finding the hidden trails she'd marked long ago, vanishing into the same silence from which she'd come. Elara moved steadily through a tangle of narrow draws, her path cutting away from the canyon toward the deeper folds of the Shavard range. The air was cooler here, the wind threading low over the ridgelines and whispering through clusters of dry brush. She carried her weight evenly, each step a calculation of silence and stability. The ground alternated between firm, dark gravel and patches of pale stone that reflected the late light in muted glints. By the time she reached the mouth of a dry ravine, the light was beginning to flatten. She paused under the shadow of an overhang, scanning the higher slopes. A flicker of color among the rocks, too angular to be natural, marked the edge of a camouflaged tarp. She adjusted her angle, peering through a gap in the stone. Under the tarp, two men crouched over a radio unit, one speaking in short, clipped bursts, the other scribbling notes. She dropped to a knee and set the Nemesis's bipod in the dirt, adjusting her elevation until the first man's shoulder filled the reticle. The shot was muffled against the rock walls, the round striking cleanly. The second man spun, hand going for his rifle, and she shifted just enough to send the follow-up through the barrel of the weapon before he could bring it up. He dove aside, scrambling for cover, but she was already moving. Circling wide, she came in from behind their position. The surviving operator looked up at the shadow falling over him, his eyes widening before the edge of her boot sent his radio skidding out of reach. She bound his hands with a section of comms wire, leaving him sitting against the stone. His gear went into her pack. His voice would not carry to anyone beyond these walls. From the ridge above the ravine, she could see the next stretch of country, a lattice of gullies feeding into a single broad valley. Movement in the far distance caught her attention, a line of figures emerging from behind a low rise, their gait measured and weapons ready. It wasn't a patrol, their formation was too deliberate, their spacing precise. Reinforcements, likely drawn by the silence on the other end of the radio she'd just cut. She tracked them through the scope until they began to fan out along the valley floor. Their leader paused near a scatter of rocks, gesturing toward the upper slopes. She followed his line, spotting two more fighters climbing toward a high perch. That would give them a commanding view over the valley, a problem if left unchecked. Elara broke from her position, angling across the slope to intercept. The climb was steep, the rock flaking away under her boots, but she kept her balance, hauling herself upward with one hand while the other steadied the rifle across her back. She reached the upper lip just as the two climbers crested from the other side. The first never saw her. She stepped in close, driving her shoulder into his chest and sending him backward down the incline. The second raised his rifle, but her shot caught the weapon's fore-end, splintering it and forcing him to drop it. He turned to run, and she let him. His retreat would draw more eyes upward, away from the valley's center. Settling behind a slab of rock, she brought the scope to bear on the reinforcements below. They had paused, confusion running through their ranks as they scanned for the source of the disruption. She began firing in a deliberate rhythm, each shot forcing them to ground or break cover. A marksman on the far flank tried to set up a position. Her round caught the leg of his bipod, toppling it sideways. The pressure from above slowed their advance, but she knew it wouldn't stop them indefinitely. When their leader signaled for a retreat to the low rise, she eased back from the edge, slipping into a narrow chute that dropped toward the valley's northern rim. From there, she could reposition to shadow them without being seen. The chute opened into a shallow basin littered with shattered rock. She crossed it quickly, keeping low, and climbed to a point where she could see the low rise clearly. The group had gathered there, some tending to the wounded, others scanning the ridges with binoculars. She studied the terrain around them, noting the approach routes and the blind spots. A cluster of thorn bushes to their west concealed a clear firing lane. She moved into it, crawling the last few meters on her stomach until she had a clean angle. The first 2 shots took down sentries on opposite flanks, breaking their perimeter in an instant. The rest scattered for cover, firing toward the ridge she'd left minutes before. She shifted again, letting their attention stay fixed on the wrong direction. From the new position, she targeted their supply packs, punching rounds through water bladders and ammunition pouches. Gear spilled into the dirt, and in the scramble to recover it, their formation fractured completely. Ilara withdrew before they could reorganize, circling back toward a ridge that overlooked the far end of the valley. She kept to the shadows, her route masked by the uneven terrain. At the ridge's crest, she lay prone and swept the area with her optics. The low rise was empty now, the reinforcements retreating in small groups toward the hills to the east. The sun was dropping fast, painting the peaks in deep orange. She used the fading light to cover her descent, moving toward a saddle that would take her deeper into the range. Beyond it lay a network of trails she could use to vanish entirely, but not before making sure no further threats remained between her and Bravo 6's exit corridor. Crossing the saddle, she found herself looking down into a gorge cut narrow by centuries of runoff. At its base, a thin stream glinted in the last light. More importantly, she saw movement, a team of fighters working to set a barricade across the gorge floor. Timber, sandbags, and coils of wire were already in place. She slid down the slope, using the noise of the stream to mask her approach. From behind a cluster of boulders, she assessed their layout. 2 guards on the upstream side, another on the downstream, and 3 moving between, hauling supplies. She timed their paths, waited until the 2 upstream were both facing away, then moved. 2 quick shots dropped the guards. She rushed the central 3 before they could react. The first going down under a strike to the sternum, the second disarmed with a twist that sent his rifle clattering into the water. The third bolted for the downstream guard, but her sidearm ended the run. Working quickly, she stripped the barricade of its critical supports, pushing timbers into the stream and cutting through the wire with the blade. By the time she was done, the structure sagged under its own weight, useless as a blockade. She left the wreckage in place. From a distance, it would still look intact, buying more time for the exfil. She climbed back to the rim of the gorge, pausing to scan the horizon. The eastern hills were dark now, their outlines fading into the sky. Somewhere out there, the remnants of the force she'd broken would be regrouping, maybe even planning another intercept. But they'd be guessing at her position, and guessing wrong. Ilara turned west, toward the shadowed valleys that would take her deeper into the range. The nemesis was a familiar weight on her back, the pack secure against her shoulders. Each step took her further from the fight, but the work was not finished. She knew the pattern too well. This was only a pause, not an end. Somewhere beyond the next rise, there would be another line to hold, another threat to take apart before it could close. And she would be there, unseen, until the last opening was cut and the path was clear. The wind carried a sharper bite as Ilara crossed into the higher valleys, her boots crunching over frost-laced gravel. The peaks on either side rose like dark ramparts, their summits shrouded in low cloud. She kept to a contour line just below the ridgeline, knowing that silhouettes against the sky were invitations to marksmen. The nemesis rode light in its case, secured against her pack, while the sidearm sat ready at her hip. Ahead, a shallow depression opened between two spurs of rock, and she dropped into it, letting the terrain shield her approach. The air here was still, muffling distant sounds into an indistinct murmur. She slowed, ears searching for rhythm within the noise, a faint metallic clink, the scrape of stone under weight. Following it, she found a vantage where she could look down onto a cluster of fighters gathered around a map spread over an ammo crate. Through the scope, she counted 8 men, their rifles within arm's reach, posture tense, but not yet under fire. At the center, a man in a dark jacket pointed repeatedly toward a feature on the map she recognized, the southern trailhead leading out of the range. If they reached it ahead of Bravo 6, they could stage another cutoff. She shifted her breathing, feeling the stock settle into her shoulder. The first round struck the crate, flipping it and sending the map into the dust. Before they could register the direction, she had already rolled 2 meters left and fired again, the leader's arms snapping back as the shot hit. The group dove for cover, returning fire toward where she had been, bullets splintering stone. Ilara stayed low, belly to the ground, crawling to a new angle. She lined up on a figure, leaning out from behind a rock, and dropped him with a controlled squeeze. Another ducked too late, a shot clipping his thigh. The survivors broke away in twos, fleeing down separate gullies. She let them go. They'd no longer be forming a unified threat. She dismantled the rifle quickly, stowing it before cutting across the slope to intercept the nearest gully. The descent was steep, forcing her to sidestep on loose shale, but she caught sight of the pair she'd driven off. They were moving fast, glancing back every few steps. She let them reach a narrowing where the walls pinched close, then stepped into view, the sidearm leveled. One froze, the other went for his weapon and fell instantly. The one still standing was ordered to drop his gear. She kicked the rifle down the slope, scooped the dropped magazines into her pouch, and waved him onward. He ran without looking back. His panic would spread faster than any signal. By the time she regained the ridge, the clouds were breaking, casting silver light over the valley. She angled west toward the southern trailhead, using the shifting shadows as cover. Cresting a knoll, she saw it, a narrow corridor between walls of stone, opening into the flatlands beyond. A good place for a last stand if it came to it. She swept the approach with binoculars. No movement yet, but disturbed gravel told her someone had been here recently. She found the signs, the faint arcs of boots pivoting, the smudge of fingers on rock where someone had tested a handhold. Whoever had scouted this route was planning to use it. She unstrapped a small pouch from her belt, taking out 2 compact charges. Placing them at staggered intervals along the inner wall, she wired the detonators to a thumb-sized trigger and set it under a loose stone where she could reach it quickly. The explosives weren't for destruction, just enough force to throw debris into the path and break momentum. From her position on the ledge above the trail, she waited. The first shapes appeared after 20 minutes, 3 fighters, cautious but determined, moving in bounding overwatch. She let them pass the first charge before pressing the trigger. The blast kicked a curtain of dust into the corridor, echoing off the walls and sending them scrambling for cover. While they choked on the haze, she shifted position and fired, the shots echoing in the confined space, giving the impression of more than one shooter. The first fell immediately, the others retreated the way they'd come. Silence returned, broken only by the settling of dust. She reset the detonators with the second charge, then moved along the wall to a higher perch. From there, she could see far down the approach, just in time to spot a larger force advancing. They came in tight formation, rifles high, the lead man scanning the high ground. Ilara kept still, waiting for them to commit to the corridor. When the bulk of the group was inside, she set off the second charge. The boom rolled through the stone, fragments clattering against their helmets. The blast itself caused no casualties, but in the chaos she sent 3 precise rounds into the formation. The rest pulled back, abandoning the choke point entirely. With the route secure for now, she descended into the corridor, checking each shadowed niche for stragglers. Finding none, she crossed to the far side and followed the trail into a shallow basin. There she paused, listening. Faint at first, then stronger, the low thump of a helicopter's rotors. This time the sound came from the friendly vector. She climbed the nearest slope to get a better view. Across the basin, figures in familiar gear emerged from the scrub. Bravo 6, moving at a steady clip toward the open flats. The extraction bird swept in low, dust pluming beneath it. She watched as the team boarded. The aircraft pivoted, and they lifted into the sky, angling away toward safety. Only when the sound had faded did she turn back toward the range. Her work here was finished, but her presence could not be tied to theirs. She moved quickly, retracing her path to the high valleys. On a ridge above the basin, she paused to take in the view. The trailhead below looked deserted now, the wind erasing the footprints as fast as they'd been made. She knelt, pulling a folded sheet from her pack, another page of ciphered notes. Coordinates, enemy unit markings, supply patterns, and times of movement were inked in her hand. She added the most recent details, then sealed the page into a waterproof sleeve. From the bottom of the pack, she took a small metal case, the kind issued years ago to a unit that didn't officially exist. Inside were a handful of items, a patch with a faded emblem, 3 shell casings marked with notches, and a strip of cloth torn from an old uniform. She slid the sealed note into the case, closed it, and tucked it back into its place. It would find its way to Rourke, the same way the others had, quietly, without explanation. With the case stowed, she rose and began walking. The peaks ahead were a darker shade now, the sun angling low behind them. Somewhere beyond there would be another map on another table, another plan meant to trap people who thought they were walking into a fair fight. She would find it before it found them. The path took her along a knife-edge ridge, the valley falling away on both sides. The wind was stronger here, tugging at her jacket, carrying with it the scent of snow from the higher slopes. She kept moving, eyes scanning the far horizon. The shadows lengthened, and the range seemed to close in around her, but she felt no weight from it. This was her element, the unseen angles, the quiet work between battles, the knowledge that somewhere out there someone would make it home because she had been here first. By the time darkness folded over the Shavad, Ilara was gone from the basin, her trail already fading into the stone. The mountains lay silent again, the wind moving through the high passes with nothing left to carry but the smell of stone and rain. Down in the lowlands, Bravo 6 would already be halfway to the airfield. Their gear stowed, their voices low as they replayed every step of the fight they'd just survived. Somewhere in those retellings there would be questions about the unseen precision that had opened their path, about the calm voice that had cut through the chaos with directions no one else could have given. Ilara's name would not be among their answers. That was how it had to be. The story worked better in shadows, carried forward as a fragment, a silhouette on a ridge, a single round at the exact second it was needed, a presence that seemed to see the whole field before anyone else knew where to look. Those fragments would change in the telling, but the core would stay true enough to do what mattered, make someone pause before walking headlong into a trap. High on the ridge, she stopped long enough to look back one last time. The route she'd cleared was invisible from here, the scuffed earth already blending into the natural lines of the terrain. The basin where she'd watched the extraction was just another hollow among dozens. There would be no trace of the barricade she dismantled. No obvious sign of the radio team she'd cut from the fight. What had happened here would dissolve into the larger weather of the war, just another operation that went right for reasons no official report could name. She adjusted the pack on her shoulders and set off into the deeper range, following a trail she could have walked blindfolded. Each bend took her further from the day's work, but not from its weight. That weight would stay until the next time the pattern appeared. Too clean, too precise, too eager to pull good people into a kill box. When it did, she would surface again, not because of orders, not for recognition, but because there was still a debt to be paid to names no one else remembered. Somewhere in a secure armory back at Stonehaven, Rourke would find a small package waiting. Inside, he'd see coordinates and notations in a cipher only 2 people alive could read. He'd understand immediately what it meant, and he'd know better than to ask for more. In the months ahead, operators moving through the Shavard would speak quietly of the Ridg shots that came from nowhere, of traps dismantled just hours before they arrived, of coded messages slipping into their comms exactly when they needed them most. They'd pass those stories to the next rotation, the way all ghost tales are passed, not as history, but as warning. And on certain nights when the air was still and the radios were quiet, someone would swear they heard a single deliberate shot roll across the valleys, a sound without a visible source. They'd look toward the high ground, scanning the rock and shadow, and find nothing at all. That was the point. This is veteran biker. If you've followed Ilara Vance through every step of this unseen fight, you know the kind of courage that doesn't wear a spotlight. If her story left you thinking about the people who do the work no one else will ever know about, let us hear it in the comments. Tell us what stood out, what stayed with you, and where in the world you're watching from. Thank you for riding with us. Make sure you're subscribed to Veteran Biker and check out the other stories waiting on your screen now. Stories of grit, resolve, and the quiet victories that change everything.